Welcome, writers! Welcome to the land of fairy tales. We are beginning a new unit on fairy tales. And that's why I'm dressed like I am today, because in fairy tales, there's different kinds of characters. And fairy tales are a kind of story that's called a folk tale. And folk tales are stories that are very, very old. In fact, some of them can be hundreds, even thousands of years old. And a folk tale is a story that was told and passed down from generation to generation. So folk tales are even older than your oldest books. Folk tales were around before stories were even written down. People would gather around a fire just like this, and they would tell stories to each other. Sometimes the stories were to entertain. Sometimes they were to teach a lesson or teach a message. And these are the kinds of stories that were folk tales. Now what we're going to be doing is fairy tales, and fairy tales are a special kind of folk tale. They have certain elements or ingredients in them that other folk tales might not have. And I'll show you those now. So we're going to be doing fairy tales. Now oftentimes fairy tales are set long ago, and so they'll often begin once upon a time. Sometimes they teach lessons. The characters in fairy tales, they can be royalty, like I am dressed up as today's. They could be magical creatures, or they could even be animals that talk or do other magical things. Magic is a big piece of it. A lot of times the big problem in the fairy tale is going to be good versus evil. Good characters and evil characters trying to do something that they shouldn't. But in fairy tales, almost always, they end with a happy ending. That's why we often hear them say, and they all lived happily ever after. Where are fairy tales set? Well, sometimes they're set, if there's royalty in the fairy tale like I'm dressed up as today, they might be set in a castle. Other times they're set in the woods or a cottage in the woods, and they can be other places too. And the other thing that's interesting about fairy tales that we should keep in mind is that there are two numbers that can be important in fairy tales, and those numbers are 3 and 7. 3 and 7 tend to come up in fairy tales quite a lot. You'll notice maybe there's 3 characters, or a character tries to do something 3 times, or the character repeats something 3 times, or 7, like Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. So those are some things for us to keep an eye out for. And so, you know fairy tales. Fairy tales are still very popular today. In fact, most of the Disney movies that you've seen or enjoyed, many of them are fairy tales. So fairy tales, Goldilocks and the 3 Bears, the 3 Billy Goats Gruff. A lot of times when you're looking at fairy tale books, when you look at the author, it's going to say retold by. Now, why is that? That's because these stories are so old, we don't even know who was the first person to make it up. So as we tell a fairy tale, we're retelling it again, retold. This Red Riding Hood story is retold by James Marshall. This fairy tale of Rumpelstiltskin is retold by Paul Zelinsky. Now, fairy tales have been told all over the world. They don't belong to just one country or just one culture. And in fact, what's interesting is sometimes the same story has been told in different places around the world. This story right here is called Lan Po Po, and it's a Red Riding Hood story from China, and it's by Ed Yong. Other times today, there's writers who want to place a fairy tale that we know pretty well in a different time or setting. This story is called Manana Iguana. It's just like the Little Red Hen, but they're setting it in the desert, and instead of using a little red hen, they use an iguana. Now there's something else that we can do as writers. We can do what's called an adaptation of a fairy tale. To adapt something means to change it. And so many fairy tale writers have taken an original fairy tale and changed it and made it their own. That's called an adaptation. You might know this one, The True Story of the 3 Little Pigs. This story is by Jon Cheshka. He decided to tell the story of the 3 little pigs but from the wolf's perspective. So he adapted it or changed it. And this one right here took the story of the gingerbread man and made it the ninja-bread man. And this is adapted too. We are going to have so much fun enjoying fairy tales, learning fairy tales, and then writing fairy tales. So let's begin our adventure together.